So thanks everyone for being here. As hopefully you know, my name is Shawn Wildermuth. I'm out of Atlanta in the United States, and well, we're going to talk about minimal APIs today. I have a quick slide about who I am. I have a YouTube channel and that sort of thing, but I'll make that brief. And I want to talk about APIs. So at Microsoft, APIs have been in sort of a weird state of flux, SOAP and then MVC Web API. And as Core came in, it was still MVC that most people used. And there seemed to have been a discussion about, there's a couple of things that minimal APIs reminded me of, and I don't know any of this to be true. So those are the best stories when they're probably false. But there seemed to have been a push with top-level statements and minimal APIs to say we can do the same thing in the same number of lines as Node, because a lot of this stuff is very Node-like, in my opinion. And just because that was, maybe one of the prevailing ideas, having less plumbing for writing APIs seemed like a good idea and seems like a good idea. So this is limited to .NET 6 and above. I'll show you the big .NET 7 feature a little later when we go through this. And I envision it not really replacing controllers in any sense, or certainly not having people go back and rewrite their APIs without controllers. It's not a replacement. I like it for prototyping because I can get an API up really quickly in an early part of a project so that our front-end people can start working with it. Microservices, where you have a small surface area that you just want to have in these silos, is also a great solution. You don't need quite the complexity you're getting from a lot of that. But they can only get so complex before suddenly going back to controllers is a good idea. And we'll actually see one of the approaches I have that I'll show you starts to feel a lot like controllers. So know that part of this is figuring out what amount of complexity you want. Make sense? So right now, there's no best practices, quote unquote. Some different ideas are coming out to make them more, to make it more obvious what the right thing to do is. And so this also means that because you're not getting the plumbing that you would get from something like a controllers, that it's up to you to deal with the complexity. So if you have, let's say, a microservice that has 5 endpoints, get all, get one, update, create and delete, right? There's not a lot of complexity there. You can do that pretty simply. But as you start to get into handling versions and handling relationships between APIs, it starts to get a little more confusing. And so controllers are still a good solution for a lot of projects, depending on what you're doing. So that's all the slides I have. We're going to do the rest, and I'm going to walk you through actually writing our own API. So I've got this, it's a .NET 7 project. At least I think it's .NET 7. Let's make sure it is, yeah. .NET 7 project. And it doesn't have any APIs. It just has this simple repository that I've injected in so we can get some data. And minimal APIs are really just written from this app object. This app object, which is where you sort of create middleware. Minimal API is just middleware. So map get, and let's say API films. And then the second parameter is a lambda. So in our case, we need a Bechtel repository, so I can just inject it there. And do what I really need to do here. So one of the ideas here that's important is that dependency injection happens by the Lambda requesting it. This is exactly how it knows what services you need. And notice these are at the API level, not at, let's say, some container or class level that you might be used to doing it. And so I could certainly here just say return repo dot get all, right? Really simple example. And if we go over, I'm running Thunder client here in Visual Studio Code. That's just it's like Postman, but it's in here. And so I've got the API here. Does it work, right? We just need to run it. I'm going to hide all the faces because it's always in front of the button I need. Let's see why that didn't. Well, that's embarrassing. API films, API films. Let me go restart it. But usually .NET Watch works exactly the way I want it to. That was weird. Might not be picking up changes in the program.cs, but we can see here our simple API just worked, right? We returned some JSON based on the objects we had in the server. All is good. And so if we're going to continue this idea, we could just make more of these, right? I'm going to make another get, but this time I'm going to say films year. And so here I'm going to get all the films for a particular year, which is something that the repository supports. And I can use the same sort of syntax that you might be used to with MVC controllers already. I can tell it this has to be a year and it has to be an integer so that I can then say get by year, pass in the year. Now, of course, I need this injected, but I also am going to need that year to be taken from the URI and just put into my parameters. Again, just like you probably are already used to doing in MVC controllers. So if I've made that change, and we'll find out, I'm going to need to restart it every time. That's very weird. And so if we look at this now for that year, we can see that all the films we're getting are from a particular year, and we should all be happy, right? And so this is kind of what happens is as you're building this up, the idea here is that you're just going to use lambdas instead of something more complicated. This is just a piece of middleware. This is just listening for a get for this and then executing this. It's really kind of that simple. And the problem here is that the code that we're running is probably too simple, right? What we really like to do here is do something like results equals get by year, so that we can go ahead and say something like if results dot count weird, there's not
you need to wait till you get by year.
Oh yeah, I do. Thank you. Is get all async too? Yeah, I should have done this before. So surprised a little at work, but here I can do this with asyncs. Let's make this async. And if it's 0, what are we going to do? We're going to return results dot no content. Now we could say not found or other things, but the important idea here is that we're going to be returning a status code. And so we're going to want to start using status codes everywhere, results.ok and the results, right? Probably shouldn't have called it results because that gets confusing, but I think you can see the sense there. The same here where I'm not going to repeat it. I could do the same thing there, certainly. Check for whether results were found and return them. And in fact, we could even put try catches in here, right? Like you would. But for us, if anything goes wrong here, it's a 500 error anyway, and that'll happen by default. So this works fine until you have 100 of them, right? For building up small versions of this, it's really pretty simple. You have parameters that are mapped, you have dependencies that are injected, and one of the things that we'd like to be able to do is often take query strings. Now, just like if you've used MVC controllers, we can add query strings in as just other values. It doesn't need to be in the path. And I'll say past and make that a question mark. Now, I'm making a question mark because it might or might not be supplied, right? And that's essentially what we need to do to think about whether it's been passed or not. So if we come here and just say passed, our call to get by year takes this Boolean in its 3 states. Null means you get all of them. True means you get only the ones that are passed. False means you only get the ones that are not passed. And so we can create APIs that support things like only passed equals true. No. Let's try it again. Passed equals true on all of these. So all the things you think about with how you want to return these things really go through a lot of the same mechanics. So how they're written is different than controllers, but a lot of the same idea. And if you're writing a small application, that's probably fine. But how do we do things like authentication and other things that would normally do at the class level or could do at the class level or with attributes? Technically, this might work, right? But it doesn't like attributes there. And so what they've done is they've created a fluent syntax from that. So I can say requires authorization for this, or produces, let's say, 200, right? It's going to produce that. We might also want to document produces innumerable film. And now I've broken it all. Oh, there we go. And so this is a different style than you're probably used to, right? This is sort of inverting the ideas of the way you would wire this up. But for simple mechanisms like this may be exactly the right thing, maybe the wrong thing. And one of the important ideas here is once we get over, a handful, we end up seeing things like refactor this into a local function, and I'll call this register APIs, right? And then we're all good, right? It's the same sort of thing. This doesn't really solve dealing with the complexity. And what I've seen a lot of people do to deal with that level of complexity is to go ahead and put these in a different class. And so if we created something like our films APIs, or let's say API, and let's bring in all the things we need, demo API dot And this will take a web app, right? Because we can effectively just do what we did in this registry APIs just in a separate class, right? This would certainly work until I'm missing references. Now, this is pair programming over the Atlantic Ocean, so I'm upset that you guys haven't seen all these mistakes already and called me on it. But either way, so here we could certainly call film API.register APIs. I think it's just register. And that would work as well, right? And so you start to get into this idea here of what sort of mechanic do I want to do to handle these? And if I'm going to use minimal APIs for larger projects, should I even use minimal APIs? And that's really a question for the community, for your organization, to figure out themselves, because except for some small bits of information that I'll show you in a minute, there really isn't this idea of how to manage them inside of a large code base. In many ways, these were purposely built to not have any complexity in them, right? If it's complex, then you probably don't need it. So let's go back to Film API and let's introduce sort of the first level. This is the new feature for .NET 7 that works with minimal APIs. In this case, we can say map group. And this allows us to give it a common URI. So here, everything's going to start with API films. And this is very similar to where you would use the route attribute in a class in a controller. And there are other things you can do with the group. That if you wanted to make the whole thing authorized, this is where you would put, require authorization or require cores or whatever the different sort of decoration of the piece. This can allow you to do it in one place instead of on every one. So you might imagine require authorization here and allow anonymous here, right? Let me get rid of the authorization since it's already there. That would be fine. But what do we do with these groups? These groups end up, the group that's returned ends up just replacing the app here. So we have these that are inside that group. And so, of course, the map get is just an empty string because we're using this as the prefix and we don't need anything else. And so, unsurprising, year becomes just the year piece that we are actually care about. I hope that makes sense. But still, this is only sharing attributes about the API in an easier way. It's not solving the bigger issue of how do you manage this in code. I've seen some people say, I just make one API in one class, and that feels too granular. And then others say, I just create them all in one class, and that also seems a little too granular. Someone did ask me a question about my thoughts on using minimal API with OData. I don't know if it's supported. I'm not a big fan of OData in general. I used to talk about it a lot, but it's never really become a standard. So I don't have good opinions there. There's some other people that are much bigger in the OData space than I, that you could probably talk to on Twitter about it. But I don't have that big of an opinion about exposing them here through OData. And I understand the idea, in case anyone doesn't know what OData is. It allows you to construct queries that are sent to the server, and the server executes those queries. And it's done with a language called OData, where you can do projections and wheres and order bys and all of those things so that you don't have to really know what all the data you need when you're writing the APIs. You can have the clients do that. There's also another technology that really doesn't work in this space either. It's in a sort of a different beast called I knew that was going to happen as soon as I started talking about it. Um, what is it? I'm sure someone here knows what it is. Query. Boy, that's embarrassing. It is. Yeah, I'll find it for you later. Does someone figure it out? GraphQL. Thank you. I got scared there for a second. I'm getting old, and I'm afraid it's starting to show. Thank you, whoever Sheffield Digital is. Is Sheffield your first name? Just a question. Kev. Of course it's Kev. Why didn't I know that? So I've come up with a solution that I've been working with my clients for handling this. And it's in pre-release because I'm not sure it's a solid idea yet. I'm hoping that as people start using it, they'll tell me how bad of an idea it is. But let's I'm going to switch over to another project called Minimal API Discovery. This is a small project that is out on NuGet right now, though it is in pre-release. And what it does is it defines an API interface, and all that interface is, and this should look familiar, is a way to register APIs within something that implements this interface. And so if we were using this, in this, what I'm about to show you, you may want to do this in your own organization and not use the NuGet package. That's less important than for you to see some of the ideas that I've been working with. Let's create a new. And in my case, I'm just going to actually add that package from NuGet. I can get rid of that. And what that's going to allow us to do is take this class and don't make it static, because I want to be able to use it inside of the dependency collection, the service collection. And so I'm just going to implement IAPI. And luckily, I've sort of already implemented it. Let's make sure I have the namespace. So I have this space where I'm going to call this class, and this class can have a number of these APIs registered. But how does it actually get registered? If we look at program, there are two calls that I use: builder.services.add APIs. I don't know what just happened. Wow, it just created the other one. There's probably a shortcut key for that. Add APIs, which will be in that same namespace. And then here, instead of calling register here, I'm going to say app.map APIs. Now, what do these actually do? There's not a lot of code in here. It's actually just two extension methods. The add APIs, let me go to not the overload, just searches assemblies either that you supply or in your app domain if you haven't supplied any for IAPI. And if it is, it registers that as a service descriptor for IAPI. Your class, it just looks at it at runtime in order to create the service collection, right? And then map APIs is even simpler. It gets all the APIs that have been registered and calls register, right? It super that simple. There's not a whole lot of magic code in here. And so by doing this, if I run this, I think it's going to fail. Because this, I'm actually going to get rid of it. That's the way it moved it. Let's see if these still work. Nope. That's interesting. What if I messed up with this beginning? I have one already in the oven. Oh, you know what? Actually, yeah. Can't have an authorization there since I don't have an authorization middleware. And still no. What did you do? Oh, that was weird. Might have to go over to my other uh, done example, but let's figure out why this isn't working. Just make sure it's actually being registered. Now listening, so no, it's not being called.
So someone in the chat has just mentioned that the route is wrong. It should be films plural.
Oh, see, that's why I have you all here. uh, if only all of you could stay on the line while I do my day job, all of that would go much more smoothly as well. So thanks for your help. That makes all the difference, doesn't it? Stop going there. And so we can see through this that the idea would be that you would just create these classes where you can register these, and it gets around actually some issues with the way that uh, um, the lambdas work in here, because there's some things that lambdas can't do. So what if we were to take this whole piece, and let's extract a method, and I'll call this get all. Oops. And notice I'm putting the name of the method, not executing the method. Because what we really want is actually to return an I result. Get all. This does a weird little thing here where you're going to want that. And let's make this async as well. Oh, I told it I result. Yeah. Results. Okay. And so why is this better than just using the Lambda? And it isn't until you need it. So it's actually in the second one that it becomes pretty important. I'll call it get one. And because the refactoring didn't help me at all, int here. I used to be good at this. And then, of course, we need a Boolean for passed. Now, if you remember, we were passing in a nullable here for bool. But what if we actually wanted it to be true by default? This doesn't work in the Lambda. Lambdas can't have default values like this. This, along with a couple of other small C# things. And it isn't really about minimal APIs that this doesn't work. It's really about how lambdas work. So how C# handles lambdas. And so there are cases where that's really useful. And for some organizations, having this more clean version of what you're actually doing might be super helpful. The other thing I like about it is, in this case, by saying that we return a result, we're guaranteeing that no one is trying to do what we were doing here, which was just return the data raw, right? Because this ends up being something that's checked by the compiler, which isn't true of the Lambda. But the big issue here, as far as I'm concerned, the big issue here is that this is starting to look a lot like a controller. Why wouldn't you just do this in a controller? And my answer is you should. Like, if that's, if you already have that skill set, you should be using controllers unless you really only have this small number. And that's sort of the dirty secret about it. Let me take a look. There's some things in chat. I see. There's a way to get around having to do this in this case. But I was just looking at the comments just to make sure there weren't any questions. So there's a good thing about what we're doing here, and that is minimal APIs fit this niche of needing small surface areas. But as soon as you start to grow up, you might decide, as you become responsible for how these are architected, to go ahead and use controllers instead. And I think that's fine. Controllers aren't going away. This is another method. This isn't the new cool method, right? And that's an important part of this, is we get, I think, focused way too closely on what is the new right way to do things. And the reality is that doesn't exist, right? As much as we want to talk about it, there's never really the right way. Having controllers and using a system where they need that convention of the name controller in the name, or the folder call controller before it starts to look at things, that's all really useful. But in essence, it's not doing a lot different than what we've built here as well, right? Something super simple to just say, oh, I'm going to have a bunch of these and they're going to register their own. Whereas something like controllers are taking the information from the methods on that controller to figure out what APIs need to be created, or what to call when that route is called. And we're just doing it in a different way. And it's important for me to say, just because I wrote this library doesn't mean it's the right way. I put this out for a bunch of feedback to see what we're missing, because there is a piece that this doesn't serve well. And I think it's important for you to kind of see what happens. So to go back to the films, and what if I were to write a constructor here? And I'll say Bechtel repository repo, right? I'm going to get it here. Why doesn't it like the films API? It really doesn't. Oh, because I typed it wrong. Then I could get rid of this in every case, right? I could just be using the one that was part of this class. But there's something very specific happening here. When it wires this up, it is producing, in essence, this is going to get caught in a closure, right? It's going to pin this instance of this class to be a singleton forever, right? For as the server is up. And that means unless this is completely stateless or just utility, like let's say logger, this is a terrible idea. Having them injected at the method level literally is more efficient. And so just because you're doing this doesn't mean, I'm going to comment these out, that this is a good idea, because we're having to think about the instances in a different way, because this class isn't being created every time the minimal API is called. Minimal API is registering this method as just a function pointer to be called when someone calls API films. And that is a different animal that you really need to make sure you're aware of as you're writing these things. Now, when it was just in program and it was just a Lambda here, who cares? But once you start to sort of try to have a system that is less prone to that error, I think you're gonna find it. In fact, we'll see if my fix from last night worked. But let's go ahead and restart the app. I'm actually warning against constructor injection because of this specific problem, right? Can't stop people from doing it because there might be valid reasons for this. But I think it's important that people sort of know how this actually works, right? One of the things I've seen a lot, because we talk about, Web API has a lot of plumbing, and Minimal API fixes that, right? It's a really slimmed down, small sort of solution that isn't nearly as complex as controllers. And while that may be true, what isn't going to happen is your APIs aren't going to be faster. Because the reality is getting to this point in the code, where it's actually doing work is incredibly fast. Like optimizing, switching all your things to minimal APIs so you can get here 2 clicks later, 2 clicks earlier, right? An amount of time that doesn't really matter. You take the network bandwidth, calling a database, doing business logic, whatever it is. This is the code that you need to optimize, not how to get to this code. And so I would strongly warn you not to try to inject minimal APIs into your system because you think they're faster, right? That's just, there are reasons to do it when you want it to be more simplified, or you want to gain the benefits of being a little more clear about what the actual APIs are called, or you want to organize them differently, or even have the API methods in another more testable piece. That's all great. But in our case, speed should never be the solution. There isn't enough of a performance difference between the two that until you get, executing 1 billion a minute, maybe you'll start to see some real times. When I've done tests comparing the two, within 1,000, I did runs of about 1,000 API calls. It was too small for me to get a counter tick over the difference between the two. It just was noise at that point. So let's go ahead and return here, and I can answer any questions. I can show you some things that I didn't cover. Is there any questions at all?
Yeah, Shawn, thanks for that. It's fantastic. I'd just like you to talk just briefly about validation, if you could. For example, you had the one of the methods called getYear, which takes an integer. If you could just briefly go over how you do the validation.
Well, validation doesn't really change. So if you're using attributes for validation, or you're running business logic, both of those are going to work, because the same model binding that is happening with minimal APIs. What you don't get support for is the API controller attribute that you might be using in MVC. which actually checks the model and returns that error automatically for you. So you don't have to check to see, model is safe there. So I don't have a good example of it right now, but because it's still using the traditional model binding, you're going to get the same experience where you will be able to check for the model. Now, the problem you have is how to get that, because unless you're using this, we really don't have a base class. If this were if this were a call that was being made in a controller, the base controller class has exposures to be able to test the model and such. And so essentially what you end up needing to do is also pass in the context, which is something you can certainly pass. And there, I believe, is where you have the model, or you can get at the model feature. There's the route values. I don't remember now, but it's validation works in a very similar way. So you're not really getting it in a different way. I'm kind of moving away from attributes for validation anyway. I'd rather use something that I pass my objects into validation in the controller, in the API calls anyway, because I want to be able to have more complex situations than I'm getting for the attributes. But part of that is I've been a long-lived hater of attributes in general as ways to communicate business logic. It's not like I never use attributes, but it's always been sort of on my radar to try to figure out a better way to do it than attributes. And there's a couple other projects out there that could do that, but I will include an example for validation when I post this up to my blog at wildermuth.com, so that at least we have a version of that. Other questions? Feel free to.
Does integration testing with the MVC.testing package work the same way?
Not really. The problem is when you're let me see what it's called again. When you're testing against these, you can't test the APIs, the API methods without actually setting up a mock server. So that may be the MVC tools you're talking about, where you can issue calls to the API and then have them return data that you can test against. That still works. One of the reasons why I like where'd it go? Why I like the idea that these are methods is that I can really just new up one of these film APIs and call this, and it doesn't really know about that this happens to be an API call, right? Except for where I included HTTP context here. Everything else is incredibly mockable, right? And so writing tests in that way without needing to actually have it run through the server means I can unit test these things. For integration tests, you're going to do the same things you've always done, which is point out a program.cs, let it set up everything out, make API calls, and hopefully get the data you expect. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Other questions? Well, if that, go ahead.
Yeah, I have one question regarding that. Like we have to use everything in a one file. So is it possible for that in the minimal API so that we can implement a different design pattern? So like that, that will be a different, we can say implement different classes. So I think that will not, I can say that will not more important in a minimal API.
Say that one more time. I was trying to understand the question.
I said, okay. Yeah, I said like design patterns, we have a implement the design pattern with the minimal APIs. So is it possible, or it is a best way to implement it, or we should go with a controller APIs?
I don't think in that particular case it matters. I think they're both going to be the same case. I'm a fan of thin APIs anyway. What I mean by that is that the API does very little work, but it calls into things that are easy to test. And so, in my mind, a lot of that, a lot of the pattern work you're doing wouldn't be in the API anyway. It would be called by the API, but not in the API. And because of that, I don't think it mattered. I think they're both equally adept at doing that.
Oh, okay.
Does that answer the question, or did I answer one that you didn't ask?
Yeah, I got it.
Great. Anyone else? I know this talk is a little short, but the minimal is the important part, right? There's just not a lot of interesting pieces here. One thing that I haven't talked about that might be useful is to know that this also works well with the documentation page. Here's another term I'm not going to be able to remember off the top of my head. But what it allows us to do is the metadata that we normally have with attributes will also be here, like with description, with group name, metadata name, summary, those sorts of things that would end up being in our documentation pages. You could also put these here. Now, at some point, is this cleaner than the attributes? I don't know that it is, because, business logic is here, and then all this other stuff is just, and we want to do this, and we want to do this. So I think your mileage is going to vary a tiny bit with that. Yeah, Swagger. Everyone said Swagger. Thank you. Swagger and Open API, and these work fine with it. There's nothing that precludes that at all. In fact, most of the demos where it creates, a hello world minimal API for you actually includes Swagger and wires it up to Swagger and all that. So, a couple more questions before I hand it back. Anyone else? Going once. Well, thanks everyone for having me here. This example and the slides will be up on my website, wildermuth.com, probably later tonight or tomorrow for sure. If you want to learn more about minimal APIs, I do have a YouTube video on it. The official docs are actually pretty useful. And if you guys know anyone that needs coaching or development help, I'm advertising for that a lot right now. That's at shawn.wildermuth.com. Thanks, everybody.